Okay, everybody, I hope everybody's connected and we're ready to go. It is 7 o'clock. I'm going to try and stay within the hour. So tonight, as I said last week, I want to spend just a little bit more time on effective playing length, and in particular, how to deal with holes that have dog legs. So before I leave, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on Google Earth doing that, as is my usual pattern. I want you to see if you can get this worksheet out that I gave you last time. If you've got one, it'll help explain what we're doing on these two holes. And I'm going to do two holes. I'm going to go back to the Woodington Lake Club that we were on last week. I think I made a comment that'd be a perfect place to have a rating clinic because they got some holes that are just perfect to exemplify what I want to talk about. And the two samples I want to do are hole number 3. So I'm going to go to that now and get on Google Earth and show you that. And if you have that form, it'll really be helpful. Okay, so you remember this last week, this was one of those did where we took a look at how the golfers would play this hole, where there's an extended penalty area carry into the green. And I think we did it for one of the tees and maybe a couple of the golfers, and then we ran out of time. But I don't want to spend much because I think we know pretty much how to do the layup holes and calculate. Is this one. It's the third hole, and there's a bunch of tees here. And as you can see, it's a very sharp dog leg. You come out to the corner here and up to the green here. And I'm going to try to do it from this tee right here. Why can't I? Am I getting my? Oh, I know. I don't have my ruler in place. Yes, I'll need that. Okay, so here's the tee that we're going to use. And the first thing we need to do, so if we're going to calculate the effective playing length of the hole, is we need to have an estimate of what its measured length would be. And I haven't got the GPS for this course out at the moment, so I'll just do a quick one here. And as you remember, we measure these dogleg holes, or any hole for that matter, to an elbow point, sort of down the middle of the fairway. Duncan's sitting right here beside me, so he can tell me whether this is a reasonable way of measuring the hole. And I think when I did it before, I ended up settling on about 356 or 357. So there's 357, and that looks like a reasonable path, I think, to measure the length of the hole. So you can write that down on the top there. Measured hole length is going to be 357. I'll go back here. There you can see it right there now. And I'm going to rate, now what I'm going to do is play a little game here. And I'm going to take these trees that are right here, this great big stand of tall trees, and I'm going to imagine moving them right over to here. So by doing that, what I'm doing is I'm creating a traditional dogleg hole that has to be played as a dogleg. There's no cutting off the corner. You just simply have to play it as a dogleg. So let's see how that hole, that 357 measured hole, would be played by our golfers. So let's start with the scratch man. That's the first one on your worksheet. So he has no choice, since this is a stand of trees that occupies this whole area in here. And they're too high to go over. And if you hit a shot over them, by the time it landed, way over here off the fairway anyway. So it's out of the question. You have to just come down to the corner. So he's probably going to play down to here somewhere, the scratch player. Let's say he does that and maybe gets just a little bit further. I can't get close to here because we want to give him sort of along the line of play in the middle of the fairway. And so let's write his first shot down as 178. So scratch man, 178. Okay, let's take it from there. And his next shot is up to about 354, shall we say. Well, it's probably going to be 357 because that's the length of the hole. So I'm going to just cheat a little bit here and say his next shot would have to be, what would it be, 357 minus 178, 357 minus 178. Oops, I haven't got my calculator on. So that's a 179. So 179 will go in here. So everybody, Does everybody see that that's pretty much, give or take a yard or two here and there, pretty much the way the scratch player has to play it because of these trees, a traditional dog leg hole. Okay, so now if we go back and take a look at the bogey player, he's going to have pretty much the same way of playing it, isn't he? He can hit it out 179 or 178 or whatever it is, the scratch player. He can get there. There's no sense using his ability to hit it 200 yards. We don't want to get too close here. You have to account for the scatter pattern, so you don't want to, the last thing you need to be is cutting the trees on the inside of a dog leg, and you have no choice but to just chip out when that happens. So we'll have him play it the same way. He goes 179, and if he's to the same place at the corner of the dog leg, his next shot would have to be a 179. So we'll go 178 for him, but he can't hit it 79. He can only hit it 170. That's his maximum full second shot. So he goes in right around here, and he ends up having a third shot, even though it's probably going to be a putt, but for whole length purposes, he comes up 9 yards short of the middle of the green. So that's the second one. Let's go back and take a look now at how the scratch lady will play it, the scratch woman. She's going to go out here to 178 again, somewhere in there. And now she's going to have that 179-yard shot to get to the green. And she's going to be able to do that. She can hit at 179. So she goes 178 plus 179. And she's there. And finally, the bogey woman player. She starts here. Now she's in a bit of a different situation than all of the others because she can only hit at 150. So she flies at 130 around here somewhere, rolls it up to 150. So she ends up about there. Now remember, we got big trees here. So she has really no alternative now except to try and get as far up the hole as she can. The question is, how close can you come to these trees? How close dare you come? And this is where you got to go back to the scatter pattern again. If you take a look at her next shot, it's going to be a full second shot. She's going to hope she can get as far down as she can with a 130-yard shot, flying at 110 and rolling at 20. And if you looked at the size of the scatter pattern for that shot, you'd have to say at least maybe about half the scatter pattern away from these trees. So you can't have her going right down on this line too close to the trees. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 130 that she can hit it. So she was at 150. So now the 130 gets her up to 280. So she can hit not to there. She can't do that because of the trees. So the best that she can do, probably, this is where judgment comes in, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. She can probably get it into somewhere around there, depending on how close these trees are here. That's all we can do, is just make an estimate of where she can get. And if you're at the golf course, that's you or your team leader's job to figure out. My criteria for this is she should be back on the line of play. There's no sense her getting way over here, pack it further just to get it way over here. That doesn't help at all. So she should be back on the line of play somewhere, but not coming too close to the trees that are cutting off the corner of the dog leg. So let's say she gets to there. So that's going to be 150 on the first shot. And if she gets up to 218, that's 68 on the second shot. Now she has to try and hit another shot to the green. And if she's at 18 and she hits at 130, she can get to 348, which is right there. She can probably make it with a 127-yard shot. Okay, does everybody see what we've done? So Duncan, take us back to here. So here's the way the four players have to, and the question is, you have to figure out what the EPL correction for this hole is. And the way to do this on these kinds of holes is to take a look at the number of shots they hit and the shot in, and ask yourself the question, what length of hole does a scratch male player usually, would he normally expect to hit 179-yard shot? And I think you'd find that that would be 250 plus 179, which is 429. So everybody, hope they understand that. So he plays this hole as if it were a 429-yard hole, but on the scorecard, it only contributes 357 yards to the measured length of the course. So he has, this hole for him, his effective playing length correction is plus, what's that, 72? It's played 72 yards longer for him. And if you look at that, it's not coincidental that the reason it's that way is because he had to hit his tee shot 72 yards shorter than normal. Okay, let's take a look at the bogey male player. He plays this hole now as a 3-shot hole with a third shot of 9 yards. So he plays this hole as if it is 379, because normally he goes 370 and 2 full shots, and then he has a 9-yard next shot. So he has turned a 357-yard hole into a 370-yard hole, or 379-yard hole, sorry. And so that for him is plus 22. So his hole is played 22 yards longer for him because of the dog leg. The scratch woman, she has a 179-yard second shot, and she will have a 179-yard second shot on a 389-yard hole, because she goes 210 on the drive normally, and 179 is 389. So she's made this hole 32 yards longer for her. And once again, if you start taking a look at this, you'll notice the 32 yards is the amount by which she had to hit her drive shorter than normal. The reason I'm doing it this way, you'll see in a minute. And then the bogey woman plays it as a 3-shot hole, and the third shot is 127. So she plays it as if it's a 407-yard hole. I believe that's the math, isn't it? She goes 280 and 2, and then 127-yard shot is 407. And so for her, she's changed into a plus 50. So the dogleg has caused them all to have a positive EPL correction to the hole. And so that when the software picks this up, it will add then to the course rating by this amount of effective yards. The only controlling on this is there is a 50-yard maximum on these holes. Okay, so let's go back to the thing. Now that was playing as a traditional dog leg. So let's just take a moment. I think this is worth spending the time on, to how it really is here. Okay, let's start with the bogey player. Well, let's start with the bogey lady. We'll do it backwards this time. So she goes down here once again, her 150, right to here. But now the situation's different. There's no trees here. These bunkers, just to tell you if you don't know the hole, they're not bad. There's a little bit of rough. It's not too bad. It's a little fescue-y, but you could certainly find your ball and play out of it most of the time. And they're not deep bunkers, and they don't have big, deep sides on them. So you can play over them. So all she has to be able to do is try to say, wants to go, I want to get her back on the line of play. So I'm going to put her up around here, somewhere with her second shot. And at 280, because that's where she would normally go. And the only question I have to decide upon here is, can she do this? And she can do this because her 280-yard shot lands at 260. So that's plenty over the bunkers, and rolls to 280. Okay, so that's the way that this shot she can certainly play, and this shot is the shot we expect her to be able to play. There's no reason she can't. And then the next shot then is up to the green. So that'd be a 52-yard shot. So she plays it as 50 plus 130 plus 52. Everybody see that? Okay. let's go back now and take a look at the scratch lady. The scratch now flies at 190. So this is a little hard to do on the golf course, but you can do it. But it's really easy to visualize here. So what I'm going to do is take an arc that's 190 long, about there, and I'm going to see where she would like to hit it to. Now, if she takes this line here, she's perfectly safe because she can land at 170. No, oh, excuse me. No, that I got ahead of myself. Goes to 190 and lands it. Here's trouble because she rolls it to 210. So she clearly can't do that. So she's either got to cut off more than that or not go as far. And scratch golfer Craig Lockett and the Golf Ontario office is a scratch golfer, and I've often asked him for guidance on this. And I said, what's the mindset of a scratch golfer on a hole like this? He says, to get as close to the hole as you can with every shot. So this is what she will probably do in my estimation. She'll fly it on a line about here and then roll it to 210 right about there. Now, if I roll it exactly to 2 here, she's going to have trouble because she's going to land in the bunker. So I got to give her a bit more room. So I'm going to say she's going to go to about here. Okay. And so 204. So she doesn't hit quite a full shot. So then the next shot she'll hit up to the green. So from 204 up to 330 is 126. So she goes 204 plus 126. Okay. Bogeyman. Well, Bogeyman's pretty similar to this, so I can do this really quickly. So the Bogeyman hits at 180, flies at 180 and rolls at 20. So there's his 180 right about there. So he could get a little closer, but he could go about there, maybe 180 and roll it to 200. Or it's better to just go to the 200, I think, right about there, and then work backwards to say if he took this line, he's pretty close to the middle of the fairway. And has he got 20 yards on that? Yes, he has. He's got plenty. He got 27 yards. So let's put him right there at 200. So Bogeyman goes 200, and now he's got 136 left to get to the green. And now for the one that's the most fun, scratch, man, flies at 230. So we'll make an arc 230 long. There's 245, that's too long. There's 230. So he can fly it anywhere along that arc. Can't fly it any further. As Craig says, no reason to not get the full 230 out of it. So I'm going to say that he probably takes this line about here and rolls it to 250 and probably tries to end up right in around there. A little bit of judgment involved. You don't want too close to this. Although if you ask Craig about that, what he would say is, okay, this is par 4. If I happen to blow it in this trap, he said, I still got a good shot at making a birdie because I got a 30-yard trap shot, and I'm never going to make worse than a par. So it's worth the risk. It's a risk reward, and it's worth the reward is worth the risk. So he's going to end up in here somewhere, and then he'll have his next shot. We'll say he hits at 240 just to pick a number, and his next one will be 36. So he goes 248 plus 36. Can you put me on that screen now? So now we got to take a look at each of these holes and see what the UPL correction is. Well, you do the same thing. You go back to look at this number. With the scratch player, what length of hole does he have a 36-yard shot into? That would be a 286-yard hole. He plays it as if it's a 200. If it was a straighter hole, it would be 286. And therefore, he's played a 357-yard hole, same length, in 286. So he has saved 71 yards, and he's served by 71 yards. So he's played this hole 71 yards shorter than the card. Bogey having a second shot of 136 on a 336-yard hole, and therefore he plays it 21 yards shorter than measured. The scratch woman has 126 yards into a in the green, a 2-shot hole, and she would normally have that 126 yard, a 236 yard hole, right? No, excuse me, that's 330 yards. She plays at 330 yards, but she'd have a 126 yard shot into a 336 yard hole. Is that correct? Yes. So she has the same EPL correction as the scratch bogey player does. She just picks a different line. Even though she hits it 10 yards further, she picks a different line. And finally, the woman has a 52 yard shot on a 332 yard hole, but it's 357, so she's minus 25. And once again, this is subject to a 50 yard maximum. So you can see, looking back at the first shot and seeing how longer or shorter than normal doesn't really have that much here. You have to look at the fine rod into the green along the arc that you've chosen and see how it compares to how the actual measured length of the hole compares to the length of a hole that the golfer would have that shot into. I think I'm gonna leave it there. The only comment I wanted to make was we can be very exact on layups for penalty areas that cross the fairway. We did those last week, and you can be very exact on those. You can't be as exact on dogs. There's a certain amount of, not error, but a certain amount of variation depending on which line you pick. And they're all possible. Remember, once you pick the line, doesn't mean the person's going to play it along that line, because they'll still have the scatter pattern problem. Play it on the outside of the scatter pattern, it'll play longer than you thought, or on the inside, it'll play even shorter. So in the new guide that comes out next year in April, the word is that they're going to offer some guidance on how to measure the effective playing length of dogleg holes. And the guidance they're going to offer is that you should ignore any effective playing length changes of less than 10 yards. 10 yards is kind of the fudge factor, the wiggle room you get for the fact that there's a certain amount of judgment involved in what line you will choose to play the hole on, and what line you choose to play the hole on is what's going to determine what your effective playing length correction is. So don't want to spend too much more time on that. It's an interesting thing, because for a long time I've been concerned, and other team leaders have been concerned about how inaccurate sometimes it is when we try to measure the effective playing length for dogleg holes. Because there's lots of dogleg holes on the course, even ones that are just like 5 degrees off of perfectly straight. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to do with this now. So I'm going to go now to get to today's work, and I'm going to spend most of the time today working on the document camera here. So the topic for today is going to be to begin to start talking about rating the obstacles on a course. And the irony of rating obstacles is the following, and it's exemplified if I go back to this diagram that we first made here. If you take a look at the course rating, the scratch course rating or the big course rating, remember we talked at the time about the fact that it had 2 components to it. One component that was due to strict yardage, and the other component that was due to the contribution that's made, the obstacles that you need to overcome. And so that's the same for the bogey over here too. And I don't think I wrote these equations out the other day, but I put them on. The scratch course rating is the sum of scratch yardage rating. You can see that by looking at this here. And the scratch obstacle stroke value, and the scratch yardage rating is the measured yardage plus or minus all of the effective playing length corrections that you've identified as you go around the course. And this is such a small percentage of the eventual outcome in both cases, a larger percentage for bogey, but still small, that it seems almost ironic that you spend like 95% of your time on a course measuring things that count for 5% of the outcome. And so the 2 takeaways from that are, because this is so important, the yardage factors, you should make sure you get them right. Concentrate on getting them right. First of all, the measurement of the course, and secondly, the 3 effective playing length factors: hole elevation, roll, and dogleg layup corrections. But the funny thing about it is, it still matters to get the stroke obstacle values, because if you took a look at just ignoring them for a moment, if you just ignored the stroke obstacle values, you still establish a slope for this set of tees just based on the yardage. And I don't think I'll be letting a cat out of the bag that the office has sort of data sheets that show what this would be, that if this course had no obstacles at all, yardage, then that kind of puts you in the church. You get in the right pew by realizing that there's a fair amount of wiggle room between in that area based on how many of the obstacles impact the scratch player severely and how many impact the bogey player. So when you come up with the course rating, before you even submit it, based on the yardage of the course, Golf Ontario and all the other golf associations will have an idea of the range in which your slope should be. And that's one of the things, the first thing they look at is this within range for yardage of that course. Anyway, I'm going to leave that now. And so now we're going to start talking about the things that make up this bogey, obstacle stroke value for scratch. And here's a little thing. I do a series of presentations to the golf management students of a Georgian college. And a little handout to them. You will have read ahead, so you realize that the way we try to evaluate obstacles in the golf course is down into 10 categories of obstacles. I think it's kind of a interesting, maybe a bit of the genius of the USGA course rating that somebody was able to, these are the 10 things, 9 really, that impact your scoring on the golf. The interesting about this is 17 or 18 years that I've been doing this, I really haven't come across any situation on the golf which hasn't been contemplated by the founders, or sounds like the Constitution, doesn't it, by the committee that devised the course rating system and accounted for within the course rating system. And of course, topography, I'm not going to waste too much time because you read all these, but topography, fairway, green target. These are new ones, as you know, penalty area crossing and penalty area crossing and penalty area lateral are new. We've had 1 year's experience with these, and these were evolved from the new simplified rules of golf, replaced out of bounds, extreme rough, and water hazards. And the trees, one of the most controversial ones, been changed, I think, every time. I think I've had 5 different ways of rating trees since I started doing this, and green surface and then psychological. And each of these obstacles then, your task is to attach a obstacle value to each of them. The obstacle values don't have very good descriptors. The very best you can say is if it's 0, it just doesn't exist. Now, it doesn't exist means out of the range of everybody's scatter pattern. They're so far the scatter pattern, and then we start looking at the tables, the distance even on the tables. 1 would be just well outside the scatter pattern. As you work up, the higher numbers represent greater degrees of difficulty that obstacle presents to your score. And the one that's really significant, you'll keep this in mind for later, is 5. The obstacle value is more significant than average if it's at 5 out of the 10. And that 5 causes a bunch of other things to kick in, as you'll see as we go. It's a limiter in some cases, and it's a motivator for additional adjustments in other cases. On this sheet, I've been wrestling with how to throw this stuff at you in what order, but at some point you're going to be collecting off a lot of data, and you have to have a way of keeping track of it and then recording it. And this is one column of a Form 1. I think you're all familiar with Form 1s. For my student George, and I really not make it simple for them, I just give them 1 column at a time. And you notice that up here in the top, if you can see it, are the 3 factors that you mainly deal with in terms of effective playing length factors: roll, elevation, hole elevation, and dogleg layup. And then each of these 9 obstacles are listed as a row. with a dark background. These would be the obstacle values you'd put in. And beside each obstacle value, there are two boxes. The box on the left corresponding to the obstacle value that you generate for scratch player playing this hole, and to the right, bogey. So now there is a provision on here for you to enter some data that you may collect that generates this rating. And if you were extremely neat and could write small, I think you could probably get all of the data that you collect on a given hole on this Form 1. The problem is that the person collecting the data and writing it down isn't always in the same place as the person who has the Form 1. You don't want everybody having a Form 1. You want one Form 1 on a hole. And so usually the people collecting the data will have some sort of a data collection form that they do later. So what I want to do now is just sort of take a look at some of these obstacle tables and take a look at some characteristics that they have in common. And I'll have to cut down the focus here a bit. They zoom on this a bit so you can get the whole table. And so essentially each obstacle, if you've been reading ahead, is accompanied by a table. And within the body of the table, you'll always find the obstacle values from a low of 0 here up to a maximum of 9. So your task will always be to select the correct cell, if you like, by finding a row, the correct row, correct column. And it's always the intersection of two variables, maybe they're not parameters, I guess, that you as the rater have to determine. And if you determine those two correctly, you'll get the correct row, you'll get the correct column, and you'll settle on the correct obstacle value. So topography then is the evaluation of the impact of terrain on play. And terrain can affect play in a number of ways. What's happening here? There we go. There's two ways terrain can affect play. One is the shot itself can be an uphill or a downhill shot, so you have to account for that. And secondly, that smaller slopes and mounds and variations within the landing zone from which you're hitting the shot can affect your lie or the stance that you have, and thereby make the shot more difficult. So when do you evaluate topography? Two things. Every approach shot to the green will have topography rating. So every time you're in a landing zone, that is the landing zone from which you hit the shot to the green, that is less than full shot, it will generate a topography rating. So someone's task at that point will be to determine the characteristics of the stance in that landing zone, the lie, the stance, and if it's the landing zone from which the approach shot is hit, it will be necessary also to determine the elevation change of the shot. That is from your feet to the level of green. I use much the same technique as you would use. You'd be there, somebody had that little level, and they'd be taking a look at the change in elevation to the nearest 10 feet between the ball when you hit it and the green surface. And anything less than 10 feet would be considered as almost level with the fairway. And there's a sign criteria as well. Uphill shots will have a positive elevation change, downhill shots will have a negative elevation change. So on every hole, you will have that. In addition to that, on every 3-shot hole, so that's for 2-shot holes, on every 3-shot hole where you have a full shot from one fairway landing zone to the next fairway landing zone before you hit the approach shot into the green, you will then take into consideration the lie and stance of the full shot you hit from the fairway. Now, in this case, we don't take into account elevation change because we're not concerned with the elevation change. We're just concerned with hitting a full shot and seeing where it goes. And if it happens to be downhill, it'll go a little further. And if it happens to be uphill, it'll probably not go as far as it wants. When you're hitting your approach shot, you need to take into account the elevation change because you'll need to hit the shot a different distance based on the elevation change. So you have that extra consideration. So on a 3-shot hole, you would have a a topography rating from the landing zone from which the fairway to fairway shot is hit. It takes into account stance only, and when you eventually get to the landing zone from which the approach shot is hit, you'll have one that takes into account the stance and the elevation change. And in all cases, pretty much all cases, when you have two obstacle values for the same obstacle in a hole, you like the higher one. The reason for that's really simple. The fact that you've got an easy stance in the first landing zone doesn't, people say, well, you should average them, but you don't. You still have to hit that shot later on that has the higher degree of difficulty. So if your first fairway to fairway landing is rated at, say, 1, just a minor problem. That's the default, by the way. You could have a fairway landing zone, it's like a billiard table. It would still get a 1. And if the next one is a 4, then the 4 is the one that predominates, and that's the one you use for the hole. Just a couple of other things here. You'll notice there seems to be a number missing here. It jumps from 1 to 3 for level, from 2 to 4, 3 to 5. And it's been that way for a long time. And the interesting irony here is that the USGA will tell you when they look at frequencies of different ratings for topography, they find the number that's missing there seems to have almost the highest frequency. Most people will do that. They'll say, well, this landing zone essentially is not too bad, minor problems, but parts of it where there's little side hill and downhill areas that if you happen to end up in that part, because you can't guarantee you'll always end up right in the middle of the landing zone, because even though that's where the middle of the scatter pattern is, the reason we have a scatter pattern is shots scatter. And so that would be where you would say, well, basically part of the landing zone is a minor problem, but there are parts of it that are a little bit awkward, and therefore I'm going to choose the one in the middle. That used to be called a tweener. And next year, when the new guide comes out, this topography rating table will be changed, and an extra column will be inserted right in there. So there will be no tweeners. It will go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the first row, and that column is going to be called minor to moderate. So what else is there to say? Oh, yes, one last thing. The other thing, too, is that for par 3 holes, if it's a reachable par 3, then your tee shot is considered to be your approach shot, isn't it? Because you're not hitting it as far as you can. You're trying to hit it a specific distance, just exactly like the shot that you would be hitting from your final landing zone on a 2 or a 3 or a 4 shot hole. The only difference being you have almost a perfect lie. It's probably, the tees are probably level and the ball is sitting up on a little wooden peg. So par 3 holes have for that reason, par 3 holes have a column of their own, and that's the column you would use on a par 3 hole. The only confusion here sometimes is what about the eligible par 3s? How do you with them? The men's holes that are from 200 up to 250, and the women's holes that are from 150 up to 10. Because of course the par of a hole is determined by the length of scratches, full shots. And the way you handle those two ranges is it's no longer a par 3 hole per se. You still have to consider it a par 3, but for purposes of topography, it's counted as a 2-shot hole. It's played not as a par 4, but it's played like a par 4. I'll deal with that a little bit later. But so bogey player in both those cases would hit a full tee shot, and then they would be in a landing zone from which they would be hitting their second shot, their approach shot, and that approach shot would be the one that determines the topography rating for the hole based on its lie and its elevation change to the green. Okay, so that's topography. And as I say, every hole, you can't avoid having a topography rating. Both golfers will have a topography rating on every hole. So the judgment call here is what's the stance like? And we used this cartoon years ago. We sent it around, and I don't know if it's much help. but it really isn't. But it's, I guess, for the minor problems at the level, it's pretty good. But at some of these lies, I would call them almost impossible. But essentially, this is where your golfing experience comes in. And I always tell my people, take a look at three things: your left foot, your right foot, and the ball. If they're all three at different levels, it's probably at least awkward. If two of them are at the same level and one's at a different level, it may be moderately awkward. And if all three of them are pretty much at the same level, then you're probably dealing with a minor or a minor to moderate problem. I don't think I've ever, in all the years I'm doing this, I've ever rated any stance or lie extremely awkward. You just don't get that, because remember, you're in a fairway landing zone when you're hitting the shot. You can get some extremely awkward lies, but not in fairway landing zone. So let's leave that at that. This is the time when I'm doing this in class where I ask, are there any questions? But I guess that's kind of pointless in this format. So the next one we come to is the fairway rating table. And I'm just going to show you this. I want to move it around. There's two rating tables here. There's a rating table for men and a rating table for women. And they have similarities and they have difference. And the interesting thing about this, I might as well tell you right now, is that in the next edition coming out for play starting in April, there will only be one fairway rating table. Take a look at both of these tables, both on the same sheet here at the same time. I can't really do that unless we cut down the focus. Cut down the zoom a bit. Okay. If you look at the body of the table, the numbers are all the same. Exactly the same patterns and everything. They go from 1 to 8, and 1, of course, is a short hole. One is a short hole with a wide fairway, and the right-hand corner is the biggest, the long hole with a very narrow fairway width. And so what's going to happen next year is this call right here is going to come down and right beside the table. And the second thing that's going to happen is the fairway width ranges that form the columns of this chart are going to be the ladies, the ones that are currently used for the ladies. So that'll make a little difference up here in the 40 to 45 range. But other than that, not much of a difference. So a couple of questions people ask me frequently on this is, why does the length of the hole matter? Why would it be different for a different? So let's look at one. I'll look at the blue one only because it shows better on the contrast on the light. Why do you have different lengths of hole ranges? And remembering that the obstacles are a measure of how difficult it is to hit the fairway. And sort of the converse of that is, how much trouble are you in if you don't? And so if you take a look at a less than 340-yard hole, you're probably going to have to hit the fairway only once on that hole. And even if you miss the fairway, if you're the scratch player, for example, you should be somewhere around 90 to 100 yards from the hole. And therefore, your recovery will be with a wedge or a 9 or something out of the rough, which won't be quite so difficult. But if you're dealing with a 425-yard hole, greater than 425, you might have to hit the fairway twice on that hole, which is an added burden. You got to hit it with your tee shot and then with your full second shot if it was 470 yards longer. But even if it's still a two-shot hole and you miss the fairway the first time, you're probably going to have to get out of the rough with a deep-faced iron or a rescue club or something like that, which is much more difficult. That's a much bigger scatter pattern than your wedge head up here. So that's pretty much the only argument that I've heard put forth for why it seems to be a bigger deal to hit the fairway on a longer hole than it is on a shorter hole. So at some point, then the people have to measure every fairway landing zone, measure its width.
Hi,
in order to enter the
Bob.
table, because if we told there's 2 entry points for the table, there's.
Bob, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. The audio is breaking up real quick. We're gonna pause real quick to clarify it. Okay, can you hear me pretty clearly?
Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me pretty clearly?
Yes, I can.
Okay, Bob, can you keep speaking?
Yep, okay. Is everybody hearing me all right? You can tell Duncan if you're not.
Keep going, yes.
So anyway, at some point then, every fairway landing zone will have to be measured for width because one of the entry point to this chart is you have to select the correct column for the width of the fairway landing zone. And your row, of course, will be determined by the length of the hole, so that's easy to do that at the beginning. Now we're going to get into the issue of adjustments. Before that, well, yeah, I think I better do it this way first. The obstacle tables that are in the book always represent kind of the simplest or most vanilla situation. So this fairway rating table will represent, they tell you up here, it generally represents fairways that are fairly level, and so that when you hit a ball in the fairway, if it lands in the fairway, it's likely to stay in the fairway. So that isn't always the case, as you know. So whenever it's a standard practice that after the table, there's always a list of adjustments that you make to the table values. In fact, we call the value you get from the table value, and we call the value for the obstacle that you get after you've considered all of the adjustments, the final value. So here are some of the most common ones. I'm going to stick with the common ones. If the shot that you're hitting to the fairway isn't a full shot, if it's a layup shot, either forced or by choice, then we take 1 off the table value. We apply the L -1 adjustment. And the reasoning being there, of course, is it's a lot easier to hit the fairway with a layup, with a 200-yard shot, say, for scratch, than it is for a 250-yard shot. And then the other thing is, you notice this has a star beside it, and that star is meant to denote that this is a shot-specific adjustment. It only applies to the shot that's the layup. Why is that important? Let me give you an example. Suppose you're playing a 3-shot hole that has 2 fairway landing zones, and suppose the first one is a layup landing zone, and suppose the table value of it were 4 because it was fairly narrow, but you had to reduce it to 3 using the L adjustment. So that rating then for the first fairway would be 3 with a little L marked beside it. And suppose then you go to your second fairway landing zone, and suppose it's a full shot to there, not a layup now a full shot from the first landing zone to the second one. And suppose it has a rating of, let's say, 4. It has a 4 again, but it wasn't a layup, so it stays as a 4. So now you've got 2 fairway ratings on the same hole, and you have to pick one. And as I said before, you always pick the higher one. Doesn't matter how easy the first shot is. If you've got that second shot that's rated at 4 as a degree of difficulty, that's the one that predominates. And so the layup adjustment doesn't apply to that second shot. And therefore, the layup adjustment really wouldn't have an effect in this case on the outcome of the hole because it's shot specific. It's not related to the hole. I'm going to go by this quickly. The V adjustment is when none of the landing zone is visible from the tee or from the fairway landing zone to the next one. It's difficult to determine the line of play. To me, it's only difficult the first time you do it. Usually you can tell pretty much where the landing zone is. Usually you can't see a landing zone because the ground from where you're hitting goes uphill a little bit, and there's a little crest before it gets a landing zone. But we have a hole like this at my course. I've probably played it 100 some odd times, well over 100 times. And I can't see the landing zone from the tee, and I can't see the green from the landing zone. I can't even see any of the pin, but I know exactly where they are. I know there's trees in the background that I can use as aiming points. So I find this a little questionable, but so I just don't use it much. The ones that are important are the width ones. And there are 2 categories of width adjustments, and these are going to be subject to a little bit of change come the new guide. And I've got a little worksheet I'll show you a bit, but basically it has to do with the tilt of the fairway and other things that make the aiming part of the fairway effectively greater or effectively less than the actual width of the fairway. So there are things that can reduce the effective width of the fairway, and there are other things that can increase the effective width of the fairway. Let me show you a bit of an example. On the right here are some examples. Suppose the fairway tilts from left to right like this top one. Well, if you start landing your golf ball over here on this side of it, you're probably not going to stay in the fairway. So in order to stay in the fairway here, this is the side view of it. You're going to have to, this isn't the sloping fairway, this is tilting from side to side. You're going to have to land the ball up here. So that kind of cuts down the effective size of the target that you have. So this would be a case where you would use the W+1 adjustment. Plus, because you're increasing the table value by 1 to reflect the increased difficulty of hitting that fairway. It's much more difficult to keep the ball in the fairway than it would be for that width of fairway if the fairway were flat. If it's ground on both sides, this would be probably grounds for using a W+2 adjustment. Now you're limited to landing it right in the middle. If you land it on either side, you're going to be in the rough. A third example of fairway contour is a cupped fairway, and this one is to your advantage because you could probably land it just in the rough on either side, and because of the contour of the rough, it would kick back in. So this would be one where you would have a W with a -1 adjustment. So this might be W+2, this might be W+1. This fairway, for its width, is going to be easier to hit. It's going to act like it's a wider fairway, and therefore you'll need to adjust whatever table value you get. And then the last one, this now has a separate obstacle value zone. That is when there are trees. I should have drawn this tree to overhang more to make it more demonstrative, but quite often you'll have a tree that isn't in the fairway, or even could be in the fairway for that matter, that kind of cuts off part of the fairway. And depending on where the tree is, and if it intersects, and the kind of tree it is, and if it has the potential to intersect the flight of the ball, this part of the fairway is pretty much not available to you. You have to steer away from it. So you really only have this part of the fairway to deal with. And therefore that would give rise then to a +1 adjustment as well. And while I have this sheet here, I'll tell you, one of the things that you have to be aware of is just measuring the width of the fairway isn't as simple as it sounds. It would be if the fairway was like a bowling alley, you could measure it anywhere. So this is a top view looking down, and sometimes fairway landing zones are wider at one end than they are at the other. And so technically speaking, in a situation like this, you should use the average width of the fairway. And of course, that would be measured at both ends and average them. But most of us, when we see this situation, we just measure them at the middle. And that's usually good enough because if you look in the table, all the columns are about 10 yards wide anyway. So unless you're very close to the dividing line between one column and the other, it's not that necessary to be all that accurate. It's a little more difficult in this case to decide what the average is because the variation in width isn't linear, but you have to come up with a way of doing it. So I don't know, you pick something, maybe there's more wide fairway than there is narrow fairway, so you might pick it up, maybe a weighted average or something down in there might be the width. The interesting situation is when the width is, it would be easily measurable except for the fact that an obstacle is narrowing the fairway landing zone. Most often that obstacle could be a tree, but it could also be, and most frequently would be probably a bunker. And there's two situations you should be aware of in this case. If the obstacle that narrows the fairway is near the beginning, the line of play comes this way. If it's near the beginning of the landing zone, then you use this narrowest width. That makes sense because that's your target. You don't want to roll it into the bunker. So if it happens to be bending, once it gets past this bunker, then you're fine because the fairway gets a little wider, but you have to get it past the bunker. If the obstacle, on the other hand, is near the end of the fairway. Now you use the average width. You don't use the narrowest part. The narrowest part is already at the front. That's already limiting your target size. So I think that's all I wanted to mention on that. So there's a little bit of knowledge and skill involved in measuring the width of the fairway, but you become accustomed to it. You'll probably have people, I have two people whose job it is to take the fairway measure, the landing zone measurements, and they're very good at this. Let me, what else I want? Oh yeah, there's one other issue here that most people have trouble understanding. And this is the last one for the bogey rating only. If a shot to a target is obstructed due to a dog leg requiring a tee shot of 200 yards in length. And basically this is the case of that first one I showed you with the trees on the inside of the dog leg. And basically it's when the bogey golfer can't hit it far enough on a dog leg to see around the corner. Okay. Then you add one or even two, but mostly one, to the fairway width rating for that particular shot. What else have I got about this? I think that's about it. So the issue then is simply table value, like the holes, no problem. Determining the width of the fairway takes a little bit of skill, unless it's like a bowling alley, but you have to do it for every fairway landing zone. Applying the necessary obstacle adjustments, the ones that are of the greatest significance are the W ones for sure. I want to talk a little bit about this one just for a second. This is a new one and it's very, very good. It's very useful. When there is a narrow, and narrow is the key word, landing zone width, it's usually near the green, that would cause a very high rating. High obstacle rating. And that high obstacle rating may not be an accurate measure of the difficulty of staying in the fairway on, say, a par 5 hole, which is long hole. And the only reason it's that high is because the golf course superintendents are in the habit of narrowing the fairways as you get closer to the green. And you may look on the table and find for that fairway width, you got a table value of 8 or 9. But that's not truly indicative of how difficult it is to stay in the fairway, because quite often these shots can be hit from the rough. They're just short shots anyway, just as easily as from the fairway. And in fact, sometimes even easier. Sometimes the fairways are cut so short in front of the green that pretty easy to chunk one. But if you got it in 2-inch rough and you're only hitting it 30 yards, you can a little easier to get the blade of the club under the ball. So this is one that was a real improvement when they put this in a couple of years ago, and they've even refined it for next year's guide, because people were saying, well, when do I use the -1? Because you reduce the impact of the high rating to be more representative of the overall challenge of staying in the fairway for the hole. When do I use the 1? When do I use the -2? And we received no guidance on this, except now the guidance we're going to get for the next rating is the -1 is when this condition, that is hitting the ball just as easily from the rough as if it were in the fairway, is only on one side. If it were on both sides, you would use the -2, but it's not guaranteed to be on both sides. The other side may have a bunker there or something, or a bunch of bushes or something. So anyway, that's something that will be apparent when you get the next guide. I think it's coming up to 8 o'clock, so I think that's probably a good place to stop for now, because the next obstacle value green target is one that's probably, they're all important, but it's the most important amongst important ones. So I think we'll leave it there for now, and 2 weeks from tonight we'll pick up. The objective 2 weeks from tonight will be to finish the obstacles, which I think we'll be able to do. And then, depending how far we get, we will decide to offer an extra webinar we might do it the same way live at 7 o'clock on a Thursday night, or we may just do it some hour somewhere. Duncan and I do it and record it and send it to you. And it will have more to do with the rating process. Like normally I would teach this in the morning in the class, and we'd go out in the afternoon and look at it immediately, look at situations and say, see here, this is the one I was talking about where the fairway's tilted. You'd have to add a W plus adjustment. So given that we can't do much of that, I was going to come up with something that would kind of simulate how you would do this when you're going around the golf course. So I guess that's it for tonight. Thank you for tuning in. And
Yeah.
Duncan, do you have anything to say?
So we have a quick question from Mike Bobs. I think this is a question that a lot of people will get. Is what is the proper procedure when there's no fairway at the landing zone? For example, the fairway does not start until maybe 130 plus yards from the tee, typically impacts the bogey lady.
Okay, there's a couple of implications of that. First of all, usually what is there is rough. And you'll see when we get up to R&R that there is an extra adjustment for that bogey golfer to account for the fact that they can't get to the fairway. The second thing is that whenever that happens, I take into account the fact that they're not going to get their normal roll. And so I would give them a +2 probably on the roll, which makes the hole longer, which means they're not going to get as far down to their next landing zone, if there is a next landing zone. The problem is when it was a 2-shot hole and there is no next landing zone, and they need a landing zone for the shot. So we don't get any guidance from that. They don't give you any guidance in the book what to do in that. So what I do is I say, okay, she's not going to get to the fairway, but if the fairway were extended back to where she lands, how big of a target would she be? Like how big of a target is she aiming at? Would she be within the fairway, or he, if in fact they had cut the grass to fairway length there and kept cutting in a straight line back from where the fairway was? I would only do that if there weren't another landing zone that would give her, based on its width, a fairway obstacle value. I don't know if that answers the question, but it comes up from time to time. It really does. The first one doesn't come up that much, that it's the only, it would be, if it's going to be the only fairway landing zone on the hole and she can't get to the fairway, it's got to be a really short hole.
Right.
So that's how we do it. Now, the other thing though is all of the other obstacles would be rated based on full shot length to get to that position. So if there's a penalty area over to the side, you'd have to measure from the middle of the landing zone where she lands, even though it's not fairway, over to the margin of the penalty area. All the other obstacles would be treated as if there was a fairway there.
Awesome.